The theme of Chapter 19 is about descent with modification, and what that means is that there is a evolutionary change that is based on the interactions between populations and their environment, which results in adaptations to increase a species' fitness. Now, all the terms that are in red, you do need to know the definitions for those. So population would be a same type of species that is living in the same environment. And when environment is referred to, it's not just the physical surroundings, but it also means other organisms that are in that physical surrounding, surrounding the population, basically. Adaptations are inherited characteristics throughout time, again, tying back to an organism's genetics or genes. And fitness means best suited for that environment. So if an organism is fit, it has a greater likelihood to survive the environment that it lives. Now, evolution is defined as, at least by Darwin, as descent with modification. So over time, organisms are going to be modified. So descent means change throughout time. And the change over time will be in the genetic composition, as I just said, I think a moment ago, of a population from generation to generation. So those are the highlights, basically, of Chapter 19.1. There were many scientists that contributed to Darwin and his descent with modification. One of the first people to help Darwin with his ideas was Aristotle. And at the time, back in the 300 BC, he believed that species were fixed and not changing or unchanging. That once they were put on Earth, that they never changed. And his idea was Scala Naturae, which says that life forms are arranged in a ladder-like or linear fashion of increasing complexity. So at the bottom of the ladder would be an organism that's very simple, maybe something like, I don't know, an earthworm, although I don't know that an earthworm is very simple, but certainly in terms of comparing it to something like us, we would be higher up on that ladder. Now, Aristotle, those ideas coincided with creationism and the Old Testament, so that Earth is around 6,000 years old, and that every species that was put on Earth by God was perfect, and it served a particular purpose. And these ideas pretty much remained solid until around the 1700s, where scientists at that point in the 1700s started having different ideas about how organisms can change over time and the idea of evolution. But this was for a very long time, according to scientists and Aristotle way back, the main idea of how organisms existed. Another scientist that contributed to Darwin's thinking is Linnaeus, and Linnaeus is the founder of taxonomy. So taxonomy is the process of giving an organism or species a specific name, which will be in Latin. That's known as binomial nomenclature. And typically when we refer to an organism, we use the genus name and then the species name. So our scientific name using binomial nomenclature is Homo sapien. So all human beings on Earth that are humans species name sapien, and moving upward is the genus. So we can have different species that are similar, and they would be considered in the same genus. So there are more than 2 levels of taxonomy. The entire classification of taxonomy, starting with the most broad, going to the more specific when we're talking about living things: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Again, domain would be a very broad category, talking about thousands, if not more, of different kinds of living things. And then species would be talking about one specific type, like human beings. The mnemonic, using an acronym for all these different levels, the mnemonic is that I use is do keep pots clean or family gets sick. So again, you just have to try to remember that the do or domain is really broad, and then the sick in species is going to be very specific. Now, how to use classification, it's based on the actual physical anatomy and the morphology. So morphology would be tying together the anatomy with the actual function, whereas anatomy is just looking at the actual characteristic on that living thing. Another scientist that contributed to Darwin's ideas, even though Cuvier strongly disagreed and opposed evolution, is George Cuvier. And he was a paleontologist who studied fossils. And what he noticed in the layers of sedimentary rock, that every level, each organism was slightly different. So the rock layers are called strata, and how sedimentary rock works is if you look at something like a body of water, so a lake, a river, the ocean even, over time there's many different bits of sediment that settle into the bottom. And over time there's so much pressure put to that bottom layer that a new layer forms. And then on top of that, a new layer, and so on and so on. So again, each layer is called the strata. And in the strata, the fossils that were found close to the top, they were extremely different from the forms that are deep inside the bottom layer or strata. Like I already said, Cuvier strongly opposed the idea of evolution. Now, what was his theory on why were the organisms so different in the different levels or layers of strata? He theorized that there had to be some type of catastrophic event that caused those species to essentially become extinct. And when there was a loss of that species in the area, that made room basically for new species to move in and repopulate that area. So the new species are not even remotely related to the organisms down below in the lower level of strata, but they're different species that immigrated into the area. And that was one explanation he had opposing evolution. So here's what I was trying to explain on the other side. You can see on the top diagram, there's a body of water, and then you can see the different strata layers. And again, I think it's pretty much common sense, but on the deep strata layers, you would have the older organisms. And again, these older organisms are not going to remotely look to, they're going to be very dissimilar to the younger strata layers, which are going to be found on top. There are two geologists which help contribute to Darwin's thinking about change over time. One of them is James Hutton, and he suggested that Earth, it didn't change from, again, a drastic event, but that it had to be a slow and gradual continuous process that was even occurring in the 1700s, that it wasn't, that Earth wasn't exactly fixed. So suggesting that a valley or a canyon is formed very slowly from the movement of a river, again, being a slow process. One of the top geologists in the 1700s into the 1800s is Charles Lyell. And he, using what Hutton was saying, said that the Earth, the changes occur at the same rate, whether it was a long time ago or into the present. And from that, Earth must be very old. So again, not thousands of years old. I don't know if Lyell necessarily said millions of years old, but certainly that Earth would have to be older than thousands of years. And Darwin took from these two ideas about change being gradual and a slow process and basically applied that to living organisms. That, again, slow and subtle changes can occur in organisms that over a long period of time would lead to a big change. So again, thinking back into what Cuvier was saying, with the very low level of strata, really old, and comparing it to the top layer of strata, those two comparisons would be the big change. But it doesn't just happen overnight, that it is a slow process leading to those changes. Up until this point, all the other scientists that were mentioned explained that there was a change over time, whether it be with living things or geology. One of the first scientists to actually have a theory of evolution and discuss the how behind the explanation for behind change over time is Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And he had two principles and two ideas explaining the how behind change over time. One of his principles is the idea of use and disuse. And he used giraffes as a perfect example and explained that they have a really long and muscular neck because they essentially wanted it to be that way. So the idea was that the giraffe would stretch its neck over and over again to reach parts of the tree to be able to eat, and over time the neck would become bigger and stronger by its use. Now, something that would be not being used or disused would deteriorate and no longer be there, possibly, whatever physical characteristic that could be. Another principle that Lamarck had is inheritance of acquired characteristics, and he said that these physical traits, these modifications, would be passed on to offspring. So again, the giraffe wants to have a bigger, stronger neck. It is going to work its way into being bigger and stronger, and that trait is going to be inherited and passed on to offspring. Now, there is an idea that he was flawed. He did recognize that a species has the ability to evolve, but his explanation was flawed in the fact that organisms have an innate internal drive to become more complex. Again, it's an idea that the giraffe wants its neck to be longer. It's going to happen, whether it be from the offspring or within that organism's lifetime, which that idea is not necessarily correct.